I will surrender my position as the Empress. Chapter 5. I won't join you, so don't wait. Adele glanced over at the table of honor, where a man and woman were seated. She noticed Elizabeth rising from her seat, a look of frustration on her face. Adele knew that she was angry with Emperor Karl for ruining the ceremony and being late on such an important day. Despite this, Adele couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration for Elizabeth's poise and grace. If Adele had remained standing at the entrance instead of taking her seat, the nobles would likely have found the situation amusing and laughed, which would have been a major embarrassment for the imperial family. Adele knew that it was important for her to maintain a sense of dignity and decorum, especially in the presence of the nobles. As she sat in her high chair, Adele watched Elizabeth approach with a sense of curiosity. Adele stood up to greet her, offering a light, soft smile and a polite greeting. "Hello, Your Majesty. My name is Elizabeth Ulrich Grand. It's nice to meet you," Adele said. The man sitting next to Elizabeth also stood up and introduced himself. "Hello, it is an honor to meet you here. My name is August Ulrich Desponge," he said. Adele responded with a gracious smile and a formal tone. "It is difficult for me to introduce myself with such polite greetings from the two of you. It would be nice to have a ceremony and proudly introduce myself as Ulrich Echmont. Even the pronunciation sounds elegant and formal. I am Adele, who want to become an Ulrich Echmont." The two chuckled, and the nobles also laughed, being careful not to offend the future empress. Duke Desponge said, "You already look like Her Majesty, the Empress of this empire. You can proudly introduce yourself as Ulrich Echmont, Your Majesty." "Thank you for the compliment," Adele said. "It is not a compliment, but a fact," Duke Desponge replied, before adding, "Now, let's take our seats. It looks like we'll have to wait a bit longer for His Majesty to come." With that, Duke Desponge sat down, and Adele followed suit. In this gathering of nobles, Adele once again demonstrated her leadership skills by simply exchanging greetings and offering a seat. It was a quality that couldn't be learned but rather was innate. Elizabeth sat down, biting her lip as if she were trying to hold back laughter. She then looked curiously at her uncle, Duke Desponge, who was sitting next to her, before turning her head away. After a while, the entrance to the great hall became noisy, signaling the arrival of the man who had made everyone wait, Emperor Karl. Adele couldn't help but feel a sense of dread wash over her as she steeled herself for the encounter, knowing that she had to maintain her empress demeanor no matter how much she wanted to run away and hide. As the attendants cleared a path for him to enter, Adele couldn't help but feel a sense of annoyance towards the man who had caused so much chaos on his own wedding day. She straightened her back and sat up straight, determined to keep her emotions in check. When Emperor Karl finally made his grand entrance, accompanied by a group of attendants bowing politely, Adele's eyes were drawn to his arrogant expression. She couldn't help but wonder how someone with such a lack of consideration for others could be the leader of their empire. Despite her misgivings, Adele forced herself to maintain a calm and composed demeanor. She knew that as the future empress, she had a role to play in the royal family, and that meant putting on a face for the public. With a deep breath, she stood up to greet her soon-to-be husband, determined to put on a strong front for the sake of her future and the empire. As they stood facing each other, the tension between them was palpable. Adele could feel goosebumps on her shoulders and ears as she faced Karl, and she couldn't help but sigh inwardly, feeling exhausted before the ceremony had even begun. The high priest who was going to perform the consecration stood up, and the attendants and maids nearby recommended that the couple begin the procession. The lady in waiting presented Adele with a bouquet, and the attendants said to Karl, "Take Her Majesty's hand, Your Majesty." But Karl, glancing at Adele, seemed not to hear and instead took the first step on his own. The chill of desolation, as if ice water had been poured over the temple, once again raged. Karl had refused to hold Adele's hand and enter with her. Even Adele, who was always careful to maintain her expression, had cracks in her facade, as if a glacier were cracking. It was as if sparks were flying from both of her eyes. She clenched her fists and teeth, determined not to let her emotions show. Adele struggled to keep up with Karl's long strides, and the two of them walked in silence, the only indication that they were in a wedding being their attire. Karl leaned over to Adele and whispered sharply, "Don't be rude." Adele was taken aback by Karl's comment. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly. "I heard you asked Diane Poitiers if she was a lady-in-waiting," Karl replied. "Since she is not a lady-in-waiting, please do not disrespect her anymore." Adele wanted to protest, to tell Karl that it was he who was being disrespectful, but she held her tongue, biting back the angry words that threatened to spill out. She could feel the heat rising in her face as she tried to take slow, deep breaths to calm herself. She couldn't even remember how she had made it to the altar, her mind consumed with the misery of this forced marriage. It was fortunate that Echmont's wedding customs did not include a kiss or facing each other. Adele glared at the high priest's shoulder, standing idly by as he recited the prayer of blessing. But it seemed that the emperor wasn't done speaking. While the high priest was in the middle of the prayer, he quietly added a word. "Today, we won't be conjoined, so please don't wait and rest," he said. "So, the two of you will be faithful to each other and set an example for everyone." Adele's thoughts unknowingly drifted as the high priest spoke. She couldn't help but laugh at the irony of it all. After all, as soon as they were married, the emperor's attitude toward her seemed to change. It was as if he were saying, "You weren't my wife before, so where was the trust?" His fidelity was clearly elsewhere. "I declare to God that from this moment on, Adelheid Kotrov becomes Adelheid Ulrich Echmont," the high priest pronounced, bringing Adele back to reality. As the high priest announced her new name, Adele closed her eyes, trying to come to terms with the reality of her situation. She was now married to Karl, the Emperor of Echmont, and there was no going back. All she could do was try to make the best of it and hope for a way out. Damn, she thought to herself. There is really no going back. After the wedding ceremony was over, Adele couldn't wait to escape the stress and embarrassment of the day. She followed her maids to the Empress Palace, trying to calm her throbbing head as she walked. Despite her best efforts, she couldn't shake the anxiety that settled in her stomach, reminding her of the day her mother had told her to give up her position as crown princess and leave Kotrov. As they approached the Empress Palace, Adele's steps slowed as she took in the sight of the golden palace, reflecting the blazing sunlight. She couldn't help but worry that life in Echmont would not be as easy as she had hoped. But had her life ever been truly merry and comfortable? Adele closed her eyes and recited the verses of her scriptures, which she always carried close to her heart. Like a lion that is not startled by loud noises, like the wind that is not caught in a net, like a lotus flower that is not polluted by mud, she chanted to herself. Then she took a deep breath and opened her eyes, determined to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Like a rhinoceros horn across the wilderness, "Go alone," she whispered to herself before moving towards the Empress Palace with a fighting spirit, more like a warrior heading to the battlefield than a newly married bride. "Yes," a maid replied. Diane was relieved when the wedding ceremony was finally done. She appreciated Echmont's simple wedding customs, as it would have been painful for her to see the whole capital celebrating the emperor's marriage. "Can you eat something now? You've skipped meals for several days already," a maid asked, trying to get Diane to eat something. Diane's face contorted at the question. She frowned and looked back at the maid, and at her sharp gaze, the maid shrank back. Noticing the scowl on Diane's face, she quickly apologized, not realizing the mistake she had made. "Please forgive me," she said. As the two women faced each other in silence, Diane's gaze was enough to make the maid quiver in fear. Lorraine, noticing the tension between them, hurriedly approached Diane, but it was too late. Diane had already erupted in anger, berating the maid for her ignorance and lack of respect. The maid apologized and begged for forgiveness, but Diane remained stern, making it clear that she expected to be treated with proper respect as the owner of the palace. Diane glared at the maids for a moment, then spoke with a cold tone. "Get out," she said, gesturing for Lorraine to leave. She approached the kneeling lady-in-waiting and held her chin, causing the maid to fill with fear. "Does this look like a common aristocratic mansion? Do you think I'm a common person?" Diane asked, her tone dripping with disdain. The maid didn't respond, too terrified to speak. Diane gently stroked the lady-in-waiting's hair and said, "Now, this is the imperial palace, right?" "Yes, lady," the maid responded. "I am the owner of this palace. How dare you say, lady?" Diane bellowed, violently pulling the maid's hair. The maid screamed in surprise and begged for forgiveness as Diane stared blankly at her. Diane brushed her hands off and stood up, causing the lady-in-waiting to collapse on the floor. "There should be a division between upper and lower. I am the owner of this ivory palace. That's why you call me princess. Got it?" Diane said sternly. "Yes, princess." Lorraine hurried to catch up with Diane as she headed towards the bedroom, looking exhausted. "Shall we put the counselor on standby?" she asked. "Tell him not to wake me up," Diane replied, lying down on her bed. She had already stopped drinking for a week and a day, and her whole body felt languid as if she had been drained of water. When tomorrow comes, her empress honor will fall, and then she will know who the true owner of this vast imperial palace is.